My son Harrison called me dead weight at our family dinner table when I mentioned having financial troubles, right there in front of his wife and our longtime housekeeper, Maria. But when Maria poured the evening tea, she served me first, and that simple gesture told me everything I needed to know about loyalty, respect, and who had really been paying attention in my own house. What happened next changed everything, because Maria hadn't just been serving tea and maintaining our home for 15 years. She'd been watching, listening, and collecting evidence that would expose Harrison's criminal activities and show him exactly what happens when you bite the hand that fed you your entire privileged life. If you've ever been dismissed by someone you sacrificed everything for, if you've ever discovered that the people you least expected were the ones who truly had your back, settle in with your coffee, because this story is about finding allies in unexpected places and what happens when entitled people underestimate everyone around them. I'm William Patterson, 68 years old, and I spent 40 years building Patterson properties from a single rental house into a commercial real estate empire worth over $50 million. Every deal, every investment, every late-night reviewing contracts was motivated by my desire to create something meaningful that I could pass on to Harrison, my only child, and the person I thought would carry on our family legacy with pride and integrity. After my wife Margaret died 3 years ago, I started having some health issues that forced me to step back from day-to-day operations and rely more heavily on Harrison, who'd been working in the business since college and seemed ready to take on greater responsibilities. I trusted him with financial decisions, gave him access to company accounts, and began the gradual transition of control that I thought would ensure Patterson Properties continued to thrive under his leadership. What I didn't realize was that Harrison had been systematically stealing from the company, manipulating financial records and transferring assets to personal accounts while playing the role of the dutiful son who was grateful for the opportunities I'd provided. While I was grieving my wife and dealing with my own health challenges, he was busy embezzling from the business I'd spent decades building. The cruelty of that dinner conversation still makes my chest tighten with anger and disappointment. My own son, looking across the mahogany table where we'd shared thousands of family meals, telling me I was worthless because I'd expressed concern about some financial irregularities I'd noticed in my personal accounts. And if you believe that family members who steal from you deserve the same consequences as strangers, that respect should be earned through character instead of demanded through DNA, hit that subscribe button right now. I'm about to tell you exactly what happens when a professional criminal underestimates the loyalty of a housekeeper who's been watching his every move, and why you should never assume that the quiet people in your life aren't paying attention to everything you do. Because what Maria told me that night after Harrison left, it was worth more than all the money he'd stolen, and it gave me the ammunition I needed to remind him that dead weight doesn't fight back, but live wire sure does. Let me take you back to when Harrison was 8 years old, standing beside me at construction sites on Saturday mornings, wearing a hard hat that was way too big for his little head, and asking endless questions about blueprints, foundation work, and why we had to check every detail twice before approving any project. "Someday this will all be yours, son," I'd tell him, and his eyes would light up with the kind of excitement that makes every sacrifice feel worthwhile. Margaret and I had tried for years to have children before Harrison was born, and when he finally arrived, we poured all our love and hopes into raising him to be the kind of man who could handle success with humility and responsibility. We sent him to the best schools, enrolled him in leadership programs, taught him the values of hard work, and treating people with dignity regardless of their position in life. Maria Santos joined our household when Harrison was 12, a recent immigrant from El Salvador who needed work and came highly recommended by friends who'd employed her sister. She was quiet, thorough, and treated our home like it was her own. taking pride in every room she maintained and every meal she prepared with care that went far beyond what her salary required. Harrison was polite to Maria in those early years, the way we'd raised him to be respectful to everyone who worked in our home. He'd thank her for doing his laundry, compliment her cooking, and sometimes practice his Spanish with her when he was studying for school exams. Margaret and I were proud of how naturally he treated Maria like a valued member of our household rather than just hired help. After Margaret's death, Maria became even more essential to our daily lives. She cooked Harrison's favorite meals when he came to visit, maintained the house with the same attention to detail Margaret had always appreciated, and provided a sense of continuity and comfort during the most difficult period of my life. She'd worked for our family for over a decade by then, and I trusted her completely with everything from grocery shopping to managing household schedules. Harrison's transformation happened gradually, so slowly, that I didn't recognize the warning signs until it was almost too late. The respectful young man who used to ask thoughtful questions about business ethics and employee relations became someone who spoke to Maria with increasing condescension, treating her like she was invisible except when he needed something from her. "Maria, make sure you iron my shirts properly this time," he'd say when visiting for business meetings, using that tone people use when they're talking to someone they consider beneath their notice. "And try to keep the noise down when you're cleaning. Some of us have important work to do." Important work. Like embezzling from the family business was more valuable than the decades of service Maria had provided to our household with loyalty and professionalism that Harrison had never bothered to appreciate or acknowledge. I should have paid more attention to how he was treating the people around him, should have recognized that someone who shows disrespect to employees and household staff will eventually show the same disrespect to family members when it becomes convenient. Character doesn't compartmentalize. If someone is cruel to people they think can't fight back, they'll be cruel to anyone when they think they can get away with it. But I was grieving Margaret, dealing with health issues that made me tired and less focused than I'd been in my prime, and trusting Harrison to handle responsibilities that I should have been monitoring more carefully. I wanted to believe that my son was the man we'd raised him to be, instead of accepting that he'd become someone who saw kindness as weakness and loyalty as something that could be exploited for personal gain. The first sign that Harrison's character had fundamentally changed came during a board meeting about 18 months after I'd started transitioning more control to him. We were discussing employee benefits for the maintenance and administrative staff at Patterson Properties, and I suggested increasing health insurance contributions and adding performance bonuses for long-term employees who'd been with the company for over 5 years. "Dad, we need to be more strategic about labor costs," Harrison said, using that patronizing tone he'd developed when discussing business decisions with me. "These people are replaceable. If we keep throwing money at them, they'll start expecting raises and benefits that eat into our profit margins. We should be focusing resources on growth and expansion, not charity for people who should be grateful to have jobs in the first place." Charity. Like treating employees with dignity and providing fair compensation was some kind of philanthropic gesture instead of basic business ethics that had helped build Patterson Properties' reputation as a company that attracted and retained quality people. "Harrison, these employees are the reason we're successful," I tried to explain. "Taking care of people who take care of our business isn't charity, it's good management. Our maintenance staff keeps our properties in excellent condition. Our administrative team handles client relationships professionally, and their loyalty has saved us money on training and turnover for years." But Harrison had already moved on to the next agenda item, dismissing my concerns with a wave of his hand, like I was some sentimental old man who didn't understand modern business practices. The benefits increase was voted down by the board members he'd been cultivating, people who were more interested in short-term profits than the long-term stability that comes from treating employees well. At home, his attitude toward Maria became increasingly dismissive and sometimes openly rude. He'd leave messes for her to clean up, change plans without notice when she'd prepared special meals for his visits, and speak about her in third person even when she was in the room, like she was furniture that happened to move around and perform tasks. "Maria's getting slow," he'd complained to his wife Rebecca during family dinners. "Maybe we should start looking for someone younger, someone who can keep up with a busy household's demands." These older employees start thinking they're entitled to job security instead of earning their positions every day. These older employees. Like 15 years of faithful service meant nothing compared to Harrison's convenience. Like Maria's dedication to our family was somehow less valuable than a younger person who might work for lower wages and accept worse treatment. I started noticing changes in the household finances that didn't make sense. Higher grocery bills when we were eating the same foods, increased utility costs when our usage hadn't changed, maintenance expenses for repairs that I couldn't remember authorizing. When I asked Harrison about these irregularities, he assured me that everything was being handled properly and that I shouldn't worry about day-to-day expenses when I had bigger strategic concerns to focus on. Bigger strategic concerns. Like wondering why my personal bank statements showed withdrawals I couldn't remember making, transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, and investment losses that seemed unusually large for the conservative portfolio management we'd always practiced. "Dad, you're getting forgetful about financial details," Harrison would say when I brought up these concerns. "That's normal at your age, and it's why you need to trust the people who are actively managing these accounts. I've got everything under control, and questioning every transaction just creates confusion and delays that hurt our efficiency." Getting forgetful. Like 40 years of successful financial management had somehow become irrelevant, because I was asking questions about irregularities that any competent businessman would want to investigate and understand. But the cruelest part of Harrison's transformation was watching him treat Maria with increasing contempt, speaking to her like she was some kind of servant who should be grateful for the privilege of working in our home instead of a valued employee who'd been part of our family for over a decade. The confrontation that shattered any remaining illusions about Harrison's character happened on a cold Tuesday evening in February, during what I'd hoped would be a pleasant family dinner with Harrison, Rebecca, and Maria, serving her famous pot roast that had been Margaret's favorite meal throughout our marriage. I'd spent the afternoon reviewing some financial statements that had been troubling me for weeks, significant discrepancies between what Patterson Properties should have been generating in revenue and what was actually appearing in the accounts I had access to. When I tried to access some investment accounts online, I discovered that my passwords had been changed and I no longer had direct access to portfolios I'd been managing for decades. "Harrison, we need to talk about some financial irregularities I've been noticing," I said during dinner, trying to keep my voice casual and non-confrontational. "I can't access several accounts that used to be under my direct control, and the revenue reports don't match what I'm seeing in the bank statements. Can you help me understand what's happening with the company finances?" The look that passed between Harrison and Rebecca should have warned me that I was walking into an ambush, but I was still naive enough to believe that my son's loyalty to our family was stronger than his greed and ambition. "Dad, the accounts are fine," Harrison said, cutting his meat with more force than necessary. "The irregularities you're seeing are just normal fluctuations in the market, and the access issues are security measures I've implemented to protect against fraud and unauthorized transactions. At your age, with your health issues, it's better for everyone if the financial management is handled by people who are actively involved in day-to-day operations. At my age, with my health issues, like being 68 years old with mild arthritis, somehow made me incapable of understanding basic accounting principles or recognizing when someone was stealing from accounts I'd built through 40 years of careful management. I'm not some invalid who can't understand financial statements, I said, my voice getting sharper despite my attempts to stay calm. Those are my accounts, my investments, my company, and I have every right to know exactly what's happening with money I've spent decades accumulating. If there are security concerns, then include me in the solutions instead of cutting me out of decisions about my own financial affairs. That's when Harrison set down his fork, looked directly at me with an expression of cold contempt I'd never seen before, and said the words that still make my chest burn with anger and betrayal. You're just dead weight now, Dad. Face reality. The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca sat frozen with her water glass halfway to her lips, clearly uncomfortable, but not willing to defend me against her husband's cruelty. Maria had just entered the dining room with the tea service, and she stopped so abruptly that the cups rattled on the silver tray she was carrying. Dead weight. My own son, the boy I'd raised with unconditional love and support, the man I'd trusted with control over the business empire I'd built specifically to provide for his future, had just dismissed me like I was some kind of burden instead of the father who'd sacrificed everything to give him opportunities and advantages I'd never had myself. Harrison, that's enough, I managed to say, my voice shaking with emotions I couldn't fully control. I don't care how frustrated you are about business decisions or financial management. You don't speak to your father that way, especially not in front of other people who work in this house. But Harrison was just getting started. Other people who work in this house? He gestured toward Maria like she was furniture. You mean the help? Dad, you're more concerned about what the maid thinks than about facing the reality that you're no longer capable of managing complex financial affairs. Maybe it's time to accept that your active business days are over and let people who understand modern markets handle things properly. The help. Maria Santos, who had cared for our household with more loyalty and professionalism than Harrison had ever shown in his entire privileged life, reduced to the help by someone who wouldn't have had a roof over his head without the foundation she'd helped maintain for 15 years. Harrison and Rebecca left immediately after that devastating dinner, but not before Harrison made a few more comments about my declining mental capacity and the need for me to accept reality about my reduced role in both business and family decisions. I sat alone at that mahogany table where we'd shared thousands of meals, feeling like I'd been punched in the chest by the person I'd loved most in the world. Maria finished serving the tea in silence, but I noticed something that should have given me hope if I'd been paying closer attention. She poured my cup first, with the same careful attention and respect she'd always shown, then looked directly at me with an expression that seemed to say, I see you, and I see what's happening here, and I don't agree with any of it. Maria, I'm sorry you had to witness that, I said, after she'd finished setting out the tea service. Harrison was out of line, and you shouldn't have had to hear him speak about you or about me that way. Mr. Patterson, she said quietly, glancing toward the front door to make sure Harrison and Rebecca had actually left. There are things you should know, things I've been seeing and hearing that you need to understand about what's really happening in this house and in your business. The next 2 hours changed everything I thought I knew about my situation, my son's character, and who had really been looking out for my interests while I was grieving Margaret and trusting Harrison to handle responsibilities he'd been abusing from the beginning. Maria had been keeping careful records of everything she'd witnessed over the past 18 months. Phone conversations Harrison thought no one was listening to, documents he'd left in his old bedroom when he visited, meetings he'd had at the house with people she didn't recognize, but who were clearly discussing financial transactions that didn't involve company business. He brings papers here sometimes, she explained, pulling a small notebook from her apron pocket where she'd been documenting dates, times, and details of suspicious activities. Papers he hides in his room, bank statements from accounts I've never heard you mention, phone calls where he talks about moving money and changing account names. I don't understand all the business words, but I understand when someone is doing things in secret that they don't want other people to know about. The notebook was filled with observations that painted a clear picture of systematic embezzlement and financial fraud. Harrison had been using his access to company accounts to transfer money to personal investments, creating false expense reports to justify withdrawals, and manipulating financial statements to hide the missing funds from auditors and accountants. Last month, he had a man here who called him about the Patterson accounts, Maria continued, her voice getting stronger as she realized I was taking her seriously and treating her observations as valuable intelligence instead of gossip. They talked about how much money they could move before you noticed, and Harrison said you were getting senile and wouldn't be able to track complex transactions much longer. Getting senile. While he was stealing from me, Harrison had been telling business associates that I was losing my mental capacity, probably setting up a narrative that would explain why I might seem confused about financial irregularities that he was creating through criminal activity. Maria had more evidence than I dared hope for. Specific dates when Harrison had brought unauthorized people to the house for financial meetings, names of companies and individuals involved in transactions I'd never approved, and most damaging of all, recordings she'd made on her phone when she'd overheard particularly incriminating conversations about hiding assets and manipulating accounting records. "Why did you keep track of all this?" I asked, genuinely curious about her motivations for such detailed surveillance of someone she could have simply ignored or avoided. "Because you and Mrs. Margaret treated me like family," she said simply. "Because in 15 years, you never spoke to me the way Harrison has been speaking to me lately, and you never made me feel like I was worth less because I clean your house and cook your food. Because I know what stealing looks like, and I know what respect looks like, and I've been watching him steal from you while treating you like you don't deserve respect in your own home." Armed with Maria's evidence and documentation, I contacted David Morrison, the attorney who'd handled my business legal affairs for over 20 years and who specialized in corporate fraud and family financial disputes. When I walked into his office with Maria's notebook and recordings, David's reaction told me everything I needed to know about the seriousness of Harrison's crimes. "William, this is one of the most comprehensive cases of embezzlement and financial fraud I've seen involving family members," David said after reviewing the evidence Maria had collected. "Your son hasn't just been stealing money. He's been running a sophisticated criminal operation using your business as his personal bank account." The forensic accounting investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Harrison's betrayal. Over the past 2 years, he'd stolen nearly $3 million from Patterson Properties, created false investment portfolios to hide the missing funds, and established a network of shell companies to launder money through accounts I didn't have access to or knowledge of. But the most devastating discovery was that Harrison had been planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could gain full legal control of the business and my personal assets. The medical appointments he'd been encouraging me to attend weren't for my health. They were opportunities for him to suggest to doctors that I was showing signs of dementia and cognitive decline that might affect my capacity to manage financial affairs. "He's been building a case to prove you're not competent to manage your own business," David explained during one of our strategy sessions. "The password changes, the restricted account access, even his comments about your declining mental capacity. It's all part of a plan to justify taking complete control of everything you've built, everything I'd built. The business empire that had taken 40 years to create, the financial security I'd earned through careful management and strategic investments, the legacy I'd hoped to pass on to someone who would honor the values and principles that had made Patterson Properties successful. Harrison had been systematically stealing all of it while planning to have me declared legally incompetent to stop him. The day we confronted Harrison with the evidence was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. David had arranged for the meeting in his law office, with court stenographers and financial auditors present to document everything Harrison said in response to the detailed accusations we were prepared to present. Harrison walked into that conference room expecting another conversation about my confusion regarding financial matters and his responsibility to protect me from my own declining judgment. Instead, he found himself facing criminal fraud charges, supported by evidence that Maria had been collecting for months while he was busy treating her like she was invisible and unimportant. Harrison, you're being formally accused of embezzlement, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. David began, reading from a legal document that detailed every transaction, every forged signature, every manipulated account that Maria's surveillance had uncovered. The look on Harrison's face was priceless, confusion shifting to panic as he realized that his dead-weight father and the help he'd been dismissing had outmaneuvered him completely. His attorney tried to argue that the evidence had been obtained improperly, but Maria's recordings were entirely legal since she'd made them in her own workplace while witnessing criminal activity that directly affected her employer's financial security. "You can't prove any of this," Harrison said finally, his voice desperate and shaky. "Those recordings are just conversations taken out of context, and the financial irregularities can be explained by market fluctuations and investment losses that any competent manager deals with regularly." That's when David played the recording, where Harrison explicitly discussed moving money before the old man figures out what's missing, and bragged about how easy it was to steal from someone who trusts family more than he watches his bank accounts. The old man. Even in his criminal planning, Harrison couldn't show basic respect for the father he'd been systematically robbing while preparing to have declared mentally incompetent. The legal resolution was swift and comprehensive. Harrison pled guilty to multiple federal charges in exchange for a reduced sentence, 5 years in federal prison, plus full restitution for the money he'd stolen, which required him to surrender assets, properties, and investments he'd purchased with embezzled funds. The business was transferred back to my complete control, with new oversight measures to prevent similar fraud in the future. But the most satisfying part wasn't the criminal prosecution or the financial recovery. It was watching Harrison realize that he'd underestimated everyone around him, especially Maria Santos, the woman he'd treated like she was invisible and worthless, while she was documenting his every criminal move with the precision of a professional investigator. Maria received a substantial reward from the funds recovered through Harrison's prosecution, enough to buy her own home and establish financial security for her own family's future. She continues to work for me by choice rather than necessity, and I've made sure she understands that she's not just an employee, she's family in the truest sense of the word. "Mr. Patterson," she told me after Harrison's sentencing, "I knew from the beginning that you were a good man who deserved better than what your son was doing to you. When someone shows you respect and kindness for 15 years, you don't forget that just because their own family member chooses to act like a criminal." The house feels different now, lighter somehow, without the tension and dishonesty that Harrison brought into every room he entered. I still miss the son I thought I'd raised, the boy who used to ask thoughtful questions and show genuine interest in building something meaningful together. But I don't miss the man he became, someone who could look at his father's love and his employees' loyalty and see only weaknesses to exploit for personal gain. People ask me if I regret prosecuting my own son, if I feel guilty about the prison sentence he's serving for crimes he committed against his own family. The answer is simple. Harrison made his choices when he decided to steal from the business I'd built specifically to provide for his future. And I made mine when I decided that criminal behavior deserves consequences regardless of DNA. Real loyalty comes from people who choose to care about you because of who you are and how you treat them. not from people who expect automatic devotion because they happen to share your DNA. Maria earned her place in my family through 15 years of consistent respect, professional service, and genuine care for my well-being. Harrison forfeited his place through systematic betrayal, criminal behavior, and contempt for the very foundation that had supported his entire life. Tell me in the comments, would you prosecute a family member who stole millions from your business while planning to have you declared mentally incompetent? Do you think DNA should protect someone from the consequences of criminal behavior? Or do actions matter more than blood relationships? Because sometimes the most important person in the room is the one everyone else ignores. And sometimes the strongest allies are the ones who choose to stand with you, not because they have to, but because they've seen your character and decided you're worth fighting for. And sometimes, when someone pours your tea first, they're not just showing courtesy, they're showing you exactly where you stand in a world that's forgotten what real respect looks like.